heard the planes coming in and everyone like stood around and looked at them. One of my mates said, "Crikey, they're Japanese."
We could see the sun glinting on the bombs as they actually left the plane.
The bombing of Darwin in February 1942 is one of Australia's greatest ever disasters.
The first time since European settlement that Australia is under attack on its own soil.
The sea was on fire. It was full of dead bodies.
We expected the Japanese to land at any time, and there's nothing to stop them whatsoever.
But the day that the war came to Australia has remained a largely untold story.
We didn't talk about it. We were ashamed to talk about it.
And the events that unfolded in the aftermath of the bombing would be a catastrophe in itself. A breakdown in civil and military leadership would lead to desertion, looting and lawlessness.
The civilian order broke down, that the defences didn't work.
There was no effective warning sounded that day.
The siren was out of action.
It was a farce.
And government cover-ups would mean that the truth stayed hidden from the Australian people for years to come.
Darwin was, in substance, without law and order. What do you say to that?
On the 19th of February 1942, a massive force of Japanese fighter planes and bombers appear out of the morning sun to the southeast of Darwin. Australia, with the vast majority of its troops fighting overseas on foreign battlefields, is unprepared and ill-equipped for war on its own doorstep. The first attack ever on Australian soil is a bombing raid of unimaginable force and devastation. Darwin Harbour is the first target. The next bombs fall on Government House. Then the post office. The barrage of bombs spreads across the town in a wave of destruction. Just 10 weeks on from the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the full force of Japan's military might is being unleashed on the Australian mainland.
More bombs dropped on Darwin than dropped on Pearl Harbor. More ships sunk. 8 ships sunk in Darwin, 4 ships sunk in Pearl Harbor. They'd come off the same aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. They were the same pilots, they were the same aircraft. This was the force that hit Pearl Harbor. And these guys knew what they were doing.
By the time the onslaught is over, the harbour, the town centre and the airbase have been destroyed. And more than 250 lives have been lost. Yet despite the extent of the disaster, the true story behind the bombing of Darwin has remained a buried chapter in Australia's history. At the onset of the Second World War, the port town of Darwin was little more than a dusty outpost at the far edge of the continent.
Well, it's always been a frontier town. It's always been a wild town, you know. It was a beer drinking and a bit lawless.
Now, the Don Hotel, you didn't go near there because it was called the Blood House. There are fights there every day of the week.
Either there would be someone thrown out or someone's going back in for more.
It was a pretty rough town. Men would come out and piss in the gutter.
Someone let loose with a 303 because there's bullet holes in the back wall. Exhibit A.
Those living the rough and tumble Darwin lifestyle were anything but prepared for a highly disciplined and well-drilled enemy that was on its way south, rapidly expanding its empire across Asia. For Japan, the war had begun back in 1937 with an invasion of China.
Now, this was quite a sort of solid little war, and it meant that the Japanese were battle-trained and battle-hardened.
The Pacific War was really instigated in some ways by the Americans because they became worried about expansion in China, Japanese expansion, and they cut off the flow of oil. Japan got 90% of its oil from America.
So the Japanese were absolutely in desperate trouble, and they took a fairly straightforward decision. They said, if we can't buy oil in the ordinary way, we'll have to go out and get it. And the nearest place to get it was Java.
But to achieve this, the Japanese would first have to knock out the powerful American Pacific Fleet, which was based at Pearl Harbor. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a brutal surprise attack on the American base. The Pacific War had begun. Pearl Harbor would not be the absolute victory Japan needed to take America out of the war, but the push south was now on.
The Japanese advance just was terrifying for Australians because, I mean, you only had to draw a line, put an arrowhead on it, and you could see where they were headed for. And they were headed for Australia. What they wanted was Australia out of the war. They wanted to deny the Americans the use of Australia as a port, as an airfield, as a barracks.
Australia had been fighting the war in Europe and the Middle East since 1939. But with nearly all of its fighting resources on the other side of the world, Australia's own defences were seriously lacking.
Australia's entire history of military involvement is that it fought overseas. We didn't do wars at home in those days.
Australia as a whole suddenly realised, yes, the Japanese are right on our doorstep and we've got no defence.
Suddenly, for the first time in its history, Darwin was a place of national importance, the front line of Australia's defence. But remote and isolated Darwin was nowhere near equipped for that task. The Darwin of 1942 did not have a parliament or any elected ministers. The federal government treated the Northern Territory like a colony, having its affairs overseen by an appointed administrator. His name was Aubrey Abbott.
Aubrey Abbott was a sort of a pretty right-wing, aloof figure. He didn't mix well. He regarded the people of Darwin as riffraff by and large. So the people of Darwin reciprocated by not liking him much.
His weakness, I think, was that he would not act without Canberra's approval. As early as the last day of December 1941, he'd telegraphed south to his masters in Canberra, asking for full powers under the emergency regulations. And he didn't get it. They dithered.
Abbott's indecisiveness and his poor relationship with the townsfolk meant that preparations for a Japanese attack were slapdash at best. His most decisive action was the decision to get people out of town.
The full cabinet today directed the War Cabinet to gazette the necessary regulations. That means
On the 12th of December 1941, Prime Minister John Curtin ordered that, with the exception of nurses and essential staff, all women and children were to be evacuated from Darwin. Despite the looming Japanese threat, not everyone was keen to go.
My mother decided she was definitely not leaving.
Mum and the two sisters, they all got ready, but my brother Bob and myself, we took off.
There was a knock on the door, and there was this huge army policeman, MP, and he said, I've come to take Mrs. Secret down to the ship. And she said, well, I'm not going. And he said, yes, you are, and if you don't leave, in 5 minutes, I'm putting you over my shoulder and I'm carrying you down there. So we put my little sister in the pram, a pusher. My brother and I had a string bag each, hanging onto each side of the pusher, and we roared down to the wharf.
The ship went without us, much to our delight. We didn't want to go.
I don't suppose the authorities knew what to do with us. Aboriginals, we weren't considered to be part of the population at that time. A lot of women were told that they were going to be sent away, so they ran into the bush and wouldn't come out. The ones from the Catholic missions, or who had been brought up on the Catholic missions, like my mother and her twin sister, they stayed around the nuns and the priests because that was what they knew best.
Although the civilians had been evacuated, it was still assumed that the Japanese army would be repelled at Singapore, the Allied stronghold, considered impregnable. But on the 15th of February, Singapore fell, triggering a sequence of events that would test Australia like never before. From Pearl Harbor to Singapore, the Japanese war machine had swept aside everything in its path in just 10 short weeks. Darwin stood next in line, its security in the hands of armed forces sadly lacking in firepower and resources.
There were 18 anti-aircraft sites around Darwin. They'd all been prepared, they were manned, except they hadn't been allowed to practice. Most of them fired a shot for the first time in their lives when the Japanese arrived. They had no practice because it might have upset the townspeople, some people had said.
And for the Navy, we had only the corvettes. The corvettes were setting out offensive ships. They were mine layers, basically, or mine sweepers, and escort ships. So really no offensive capacity at all.
The RAAF has nothing. The RAAF has 5 Wirraways, which are in fact trainers with a couple of machine guns strapped onto them. They are all unserviceable. None of them takes off, they're all on the ground.
For the men at the front line of the nation's defence, the situation looked grim.
I didn't have a weapon, didn't have a rifle, didn't have anything at all.
We only had one 4.7 Mark 16. We had no ammunition. I suppose we were supposed to say bang or something like that.
We were heavily armed with 6 World War I rifles and about 20 rounds of ammunition and a magazine which held about 5 bullets, and they were all locked in the wardroom.
Live ammunition, what was that? We didn't see live ammunition until the day we went into action. It was rather weird, really, because nobody knew what the sound of a gun being fired sounded like. Because there's only 1 rifle issued amongst 5 men with us, and 5 rounds of ammunition. So we're well and truly armed for an invasion.
On the morning of the 19th of February 1942, 350 kilometres to the northwest, the 188-strong Japanese strike force takes off, bound for Darwin.
The Japanese fleet's made up of 4 aircraft carriers, 17 ships all up. The fleet turns into the wind and starts launching its aircraft.
Father John McGrath, a missionary on Bathurst Island, 80 kilometres to the north of Darwin, sees a huge flight of planes overhead and calls the Darwin Civil Radio Station.
Big flight of planes passed over, going south. Very high. Over.
The civilian operator who took the message, Lou Kernock, said to him, "Stand by." Well, Father McGrath had very little chance to stand by because suddenly a Japanese Zero came strafing the airfield and he had to run for cover.
Bryce Bellett was there when the message came through to the RAAF base.
And the procedure was to pass it on to RAF operations. It was taken by P.O. Saxton, and he advised the chap in charge of operations room, who went downstairs to see the CO.
Earlier that morning, a group of 10 American Kitty Hawks had taken off, bound for Indonesia. But a weather warning en route had made them turn back for Darwin.
Because they were confusing it with returning Kitty Hawks, they decided not to ring the alarm.
Now, what should have happened is RWF Operations receives the warning. It informs the Joint Command. They are meant to get onto the air raid sirens and tell the air raid wardens to sound the sirens. People are then meant to hear the sirens and get into their slit trenches. Boats in the harbour are meant to start their engines and be ready to take evasive action. None of this happened. Nothing.
It's a Thursday morning, the tide's going out. The workers down at the wharf are doing their usual bits and pieces. The town is slowly going about its business.
The harbour that morning is packed with ships, 45 in all. Dorothy Fox's father was working on the wharf.
On the day, Uncle Edward, for some reason, couldn't go to work. So my father John stepped in for him, and 3 other brothers all went down to the wharf, and they were working on the ships. My father was on the Neptuna, which was taken over as a munitions ship.
Just before 10 o'clock, the wharfies break for smoko and gather at their recreation hut. Unknown to them and everyone else in the harbour, the strike force is rapidly approaching.
They circled to the south and to the east of Darwin. They crossed the coast well east of Darwin and they made a big circle. So they're attacking Darwin from the south and east. That's the last direction you would expect enemy aircraft to come from.
We saw these planes, masses of planes.
One of us yelled out, "Oh, the Americans have arrived."
And I heard this noise, looked up, and here's the Yanks coming, hundreds of Yanks.
And started to count how many there were, and then one of my mates said, "Crikey, they're Japanese."
The first of the attackers to descend on Darwin is the group of 9 Zeros that had broken off from the main force at Bathurst Island.
A rotten little Jap come over, started strafing us. Oh, I tell you what, me mate was singing out for his mum. I couldn't sing out, I was too scared.
And the 9 Zeros arrive and they see the 10 Kitty Hawks that are landing, refuelling, taking off and so on. And as good fighter pilots do, they set about the enemy and they shoot them down in rapid succession.
I turned over on my back, I wanted to see what was going on. And a poor damn Kitty Hawk, he's only about, wouldn't be any more than 100 feet up, going like the bats out of hell with a rotten little nip on his tail. In just the short distance that I seen them, that plane fell to pieces in the air with the bullets, you know. Then the little rotters come back and strafed us then.
There's almost no aerial defence of Darwin left. So then the field is wide open for the bombers to start coming in and laying their bombs.
First attack comes from the high-flying Kates. These are single-engine aircraft, 3-man crew, and they carry quite heavy bombs.
As they were coming out of the sun, we could see the sun glinting on the bombs as they actually left the plane.
So the first bombs to hit Australian waters would have been at the Darwin Harbour and, of course, the wharf. My father was on the Neptuna. Where he was standing was where the plane hit, or the bomb hit, and nothing was ever found.
"23 wharfies are killed in that one strike. From the harbour, the path of bombs sweeps towards the centre of town. Darwin is now under attack, but it's only as the bombs begin raining down that the air raid sirens begin to sound their warning.
The first bomb fell about 2 minutes to 10, and just as it fell, the air raid siren went. So there's absolutely no warning.
One of the first places to come under fire is the residence of the Chief Administrator, Aubrey Abbott. Along with his wife and staff, he makes it to shelter moments before a bomb hits. young Aboriginal housekeeper, Daisy Martin, is killed in the explosion, and Abbott himself is severely shaken. At the post office, Jack Burks joins the rest of the staff in a rush for the door.
I started to go and then went back and locked my two money order drawers. And I think probably I was the last one out. As I went out, I saw the postmaster with the telephonist taking them into his shelter. And I looked up the alleyway, saw a chap running up there, and I thought I'll follow him, so I did. We got out to the main street. There were planes, you could hear planes coming, and other staff that were there yelled out, "Lie down." So we lay down in the gutter.
The post office, they had the best air raid shelter in Darwin, the post office. Everybody knew theirs was the best. They dug a quite deep slit trench. They'd covered it over with a curved iron roof and to protect them from rubble and whatever.
And a bomb fell just the other side of the road from us. We got showered with debris, stones and dirt and all sorts.
And it was always understood that the only thing that could do this air raid shelter any damage was a direct hit. It took a direct hit.
10 people are killed instantly, including Postmaster Hurtle Bald, his wife and daughter.
I knew the Bald family from my hometown of Port Lincoln in South Australia. Mr. Bald was postmaster there before his appointment to Darwin. Their place became more or less an open house as far as I was concerned. As a matter of fact, I had dinner with the Bald family on that night, and the thought always comes back to me that 12 hours later, that they were all dead. Just devastating as far as I was concerned.
The first wave of high-level Japanese bombers has left a trail of devastation across a wide area of Darwin. Yet the raid is only 5 minutes old. Now the dive bombers arrive, descending on the harbour in a screaming swarm.
They were that close that I could see the pilots quite clearly, their teeth. I could see their teeth, their eyes.
Out of all the ships there, the most valuable prize for the Japanese bombers is the American destroyer, the USS Peary.
I froze. In front of me was a dive bomber, and time seemed to stop. He glared at me with sunglasses, and I saw the bomb underneath his aircraft, and I thought, what am I going to bloody do? And I thought, I'll have to catch the bomb or something like that. But the Peary come behind us, and he saw the Peary, he swerved. I saw the bomb that left his plane, and it went about that angle like that, hit the midships, and the stern sunk immediately with all hands.
The sinking of the USS Peary would be the biggest single blow dealt by the Japanese on the day, with 89 crew members dead.
By this time, the entire harbour is full of ships going left, right and centre, ships firing everything they've got at the Japanese aircraft, and some ships unfortunately being sunk. We had 8 sunk altogether in the harbour.
While the assault continues in the harbour, up above on the cliff tops, the anti-aircraft guns are providing the town's only real defence.
My position in the first raid on the 19th of February was number 5 fire on number 1 gun. Number 1 gun was the closest gun to the cliff edge. We were firing the guns as fast as we could get the shells away. We were lucky enough to hit a dive bomber, which went straight into the sea. I do believe that he ran into our shell rather than a shell ran into him because we were firing indiscriminately.
The RAAF base is next to come under fire. Stationed on the edge of the base is the 2nd Heavy Anti-Aircraft Battery.
The alarm was sounded and the gunners went to the guns. They started firing, but of course, having no training, they weren't very effective at all. They were either below or behind the targets all the time. Both the battery commanders worked it out that the shells that we had were never calibrated for tropical conditions.
With such little resistance, the airbase becomes an easy target.
We're looking out through a window which is just behind the receiver, and we witnessed 12 and 13 squadron hangars go up, and we saw quite a few Lockheed Hudsons shot up. Some of them were bombed up. I've got to say, it was a pretty dangerous place to be.
There were some tremendous acts of valour on the day. Gunner Darky Hudson, who was manning a Lewis gun, not getting a decent angle on it. He was in the showers. Ran out with his boots and towel on and his helmet, as you had to have on, and takes up his Lewis gun and tried to get a decent shot at aircraft and failed.
The towel dropped off him and he was just stark naked, just apart from a tin hat and a pair of boots. But he still carried on firing all the time.
And finally he pours fire into what was a passing bomber, and it looks like he and several others managed to bring it down between them.
And we often used to say to Darky, you know, well, come on Darky, let's tell us the real truth now. Did you actually shoot it down? Or was it the fact that you're standing there stark naked in all your glory that the Japanese pilot looked over the side of the plane and just died of fright?
As the airfield takes a pounding, the carnage continues out on the water.
So Darwin Harbour is now on fire. Just picture the scene. There's black smoke everywhere, howling dive bombers, strafing Zeros, and guys in burning water, just because burning water is better than sinking ships. So they've taken their chances by just diving over the side and hoping for the best.
The most unfortunate aspect of the maritime side of things, I suppose, is the loss of the Neptuna. She's a ship alongside the wharf and she has 200 depth charges on board. She was hit and caught fire.
Guy Day-Lewis was on the wharf waiting to collect supplies when the Neptuna was first hit.
Well, the situation was we had the Neptuna on fire, loaded with ammunition. We couldn't go that way. We couldn't go from where the wharfie shed was because that wharf had been blown away. There was nothing there. We were trapped in the middle.
Meanwhile, the ammunition on board is beginning to ignite.
It started off just mildly, just a few cracker shots, small arms exploding, and then it created a crescendo that was so loud that it was frightening. It was then that we decided we'll go.
Guy Day-Lewis jumps from the wharf into a sea already full of debris and dead bodies and swims for his life.
Oh, it would have been 60 yards, I suppose, by this time when it blew.
Ron Carter's ship was only 100 metres away.
It blew us all off our feet. Fortunately, the Neptuna leant over that way and all the crap went right over the harbour, miles inland.
Man, did she go. And I got blown off my bike with a concussion. Luckily I did, because just above my head there was a pile of about that round stuck in the bank just above my head from the main jetty. Oh, I was lucky.
And in the midst of all this, a bit of a rescue operation begins, but it's so makeshift. The Menunda lowered her lifeboats and sent the lifeboats out into the burning water to pick up sailors. There were guys in rowboats rowing into the oil and the muck just to see who they could rescue.
Having made a lucky escape himself, Guy Day-Lewis joins in the rescue of the injured sailors still caught in the water.
They were covered in this thick oil. We took them ashore and tried to hand them over to somebody, I don't know who we did, But we got them out of the water, that was the main thing.
They were shocking. I mean, there was skin hanging off them like tissue paper. Off their arms, off their chest, they had no clothes on. Boiled.
When we were coming in to rescue, the sea was on fire, and this bloke jumped overboard from the wharf into a burning sea. We couldn't rescue him because he was too far away from us, and we couldn't manoeuvre. He got burnt alive anyway.
I get the heebie-jeebies to think about it.
After 40 minutes of continuous bombing, the onslaught is finally over. The last Japanese plane turns away from Darwin and the all clear is sounded. For the first time in its history, Australia has felt the full brunt of war on its own shore. Left behind is a massive trail of death and destruction.
Fires burning. There were still terrible problems on the harbour with burning oil and so on. But the civilian population was at that point not in any kind of mess. The Japanese came back.
It is now just before midday. Battered and shaken by the first bombing blitz, Darwin has barely had any time to recover when the sky is full again with enemy planes.
Second raid was a different affair. It was obviously timed to take place carefully after the first one had cleared itself away, but it was land-based bombers from the Celebes.
These were heavy twin-engine bombers with bigger, stronger bombs. Now, they basically headed for the RAAF field. They weren't interested anymore in the harbour, they weren't interested in the town. They were only interested in taking the RAAF field out of the war.
They came in 3 lots of 9s in a wave of 27 at a time, as though they were having a flyby.
We went back to our trenches and some fairly high explosive stuff came down from that.
You could hear the bombs whistling across us, and they say if you can hear them whistling, you're not going to get hit.
So something like 6,500 kilos of military-grade high explosive is going off more or less simultaneously.
The noise was so strong. The trench was moving. The trench was, there's another one, and it would move the earth.
The second raid lasts 20 minutes. Darwin has now received 2 brutal assaults in the space of 2.5 hours. The town is left in a state of shock.
You've got a scene of complete chaos in the town, with people not knowing where to go or what to do.
There are now hundreds of casualties, a town in ruins, and the fear of an impending Japanese invasion. Darwin is in need of leadership.
Basically, what you have to do in all these circumstances, you have to get an iron grip on the town. It did not happen.
The man expected to take charge of the situation is Chief Administrator Aubrey Abbott.
Abbott didn't know what he should do. He would assume the military would take over. The military didn't actually take over till the 23rd. And Major General Blake didn't know what to do either.
Aubrey Abbott, the administrator, who was the prime candidate to get a grip on the town, focused on the fact that maybe there'd be looting, and in particular he didn't want the fine china and glassware and silverware of Government House to be lifted, nor in particular did he want the wines in his wine cellar to be stolen. And so it focused on securing all the valuables in Government House. There were 15 policemen in Darwin at that time, and at one point 4 of those 15 policemen were doing what amounted to domestic stuff for Aubrey Abbott, in the worst emergency Darwin's ever had. If we just now, let's stand back and look at the situation in Darwin. The boss, the administrator, Aubrey Abbott, is hard at work sorting out his wine cellar and his cups and saucers. The result was just anarchy in the town. There was nobody in charge. It was chaotic. It was just out of control.
But in the days after the bombings, Abbott himself was painting a very different picture.
Abbott was sending cables back to the Minister for Territories saying situation normal in Darwin. And he sent a succession of cables saying everything was hunky-dory in Darwin.
In the aftermath of the attacks, contradicting reports began circulating about the true state of affairs in Darwin. In order to uncover the truth, the government takes action. On March the 4th, just 2 weeks after the bombings, Supreme Court Judge Charles Lowe arrives to lead a secret royal commission into the raids.
I, Aubrey Abbott, do swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall
Lowe,
give shall be the
with King's Counsel John Barry assisting him, sets out to examine all aspects surrounding the events of the 19th of February. The revelations would be startling.
And there is the statement again. Everything is normal, whereas everything was not normal.
Perhaps the word normal was the wrong word to use.
Was the siren sounded at Larrakia?
The siren was out of action there. It was being repaired.
There was no effective warning sounded that day.
That is so.
The administrators completely lost the confidence of the public.
I'm perfectly sure of it.
Yes.
Of particular concern to Lowe are allegations of a breakdown in civil and military authority that lead to Darwin descending into chaos and disorder.
The suggestion is that at a time when the administrator's duty was to concern himself with the physical welfare of the people of Darwin, you were more concerned with the salvaging of property from Government House.
I have concerned myself with the welfare of the people remaining in Darwin. I arranged they should be fed and that a kitchen should be started.
You will agree that an example should be set by responsible people to the citizens of Darwin so as to restore confidence.
I do not think my actions militated against that.
The inquiry would learn that the second raid had indeed shattered the confidence of the town, and that the events that unfolded on the afternoon of the bombings would leave Darwin in disarray.
The brutality of that raid was very marked. And the fact that it happened so quickly after the first raid, that turned the mood in the town.
Expecting further raids and fearing an invasion is imminent, confusion begins to reign amongst the civilian population.
The most sensible thing to do when people are shooting at you is to get out of the way. So that was precisely what they set about doing. And the nearest place that they could get to was Adelaide River, so they all headed for Adelaide River.
In what has become known as the Adelaide River Stakes, the citizens of Darwin hit the road, heading for the township of Adelaide River, 120 kilometres to the south.
Do you think that any steps might have been taken on the 19th which were not taken, and which might, in the event of any future raids, prevent a stampede of the civilian population such as occurred?
No. I have given it a lot of thought, and I have mentioned in a report to the government, the bombing of civilians has a most extraordinary effect on them. And short of force and an adequate
leadership,
I do not know what steps can be taken where you have such a small staff as the administration had to deal with the position.
You know, did Darwin panic? Well, I think that people disappearing down the Adelaide River Road, people not knowing whom to listen to and what to do. I think that the conditions in Darwin, if they didn't meet all the criteria for panic, they were pretty close to it.
As civilians continued to pour out of town, the armed forces were close behind.
The army moved out and they went down to Adelaide River. All that was left in Darwin was the anti-aircraft, the Navy, searchlights, shore gunners. We were, what's the word for disposable? There's no doubt about that.
The Air Force was preparing to evacuate as well, but a breakdown in communication would cause mayhem and lead to acts of desertion.
Now, the RAAF base had taken a real beating. Confusion seems to have reigned. I mean, nobody got a proper grip on the RAAF base. Instead, the base commander, Sturt Griffith, formed a perfectly plausible scheme, which was to move the men half a mile down the road and half a mile into the bush and give them some lunch. And he'd go down and address them. Instead of assembling all the men and saying, right, this is what I want you to do, he told his adjutant, Swan, to pass this order on. Swan told one group of people, do this. They told the next, and they told the next, and they told the next. It was Chinese whispers.
The adjutant of the station came by with a jeep, and he instructed me to go south half a mile and in the bush half a mile. I got the right instruction out, but there's a hell of a lot of sections that didn't get the right direction.
Do you know what order was transmitted?
It appears that some men were told, although by whom I cannot track down, that they were to go to Bachelor. Some men that they were to go 5 miles down the road. Some men that they were to go half a mile down the road. Some that they were to go the 2 mile.
An officer came along and saw us, said, there's orders out that would you go south for 1 mile and east for 1 mile, and supplies will be brought down there to you.
We realised that complete confusion had taken place. You know, people were scattered along the track and they weren't where they're supposed to be. But we determined what a half a mile was and another half in the bush, but we couldn't see anyone around.
Nothing turned up. Nobody turned up. There was just no organisation. That organisation didn't exist.
And it was obvious that confusion had set in. And we thought it was fit and proper that we both go back and await on instructions. But the base was deserted when we went back.
The 1,000 airmen on the base evaporated. They just went. One bloke finished up in Melbourne 13 days later. So at this point, the Navy's still in place. They haven't disappeared. The Army's moved down the road except for the AA gunners. The RAAF has evaporated into the bush, but it doesn't have any aeroplanes anyway, so, I mean, there's nothing much lost here. So Darwin is not looking good.
As night fell, Darwin was a town in turmoil, nervously awaiting what the morning would bring. Softened up by the bombing raids and left virtually defenceless, Darwin faces the prospect of being the landing point of a Japanese invasion of Australia.
We expected the Japanese to land at any time, and there's nothing to stop them whatsoever. They could have landed quite easily.
The Navy was left in charge. We were given 303 rifles. The only trouble was with that was we had 45 ammunition and it just won't go up the barrel of a 303.
That the Japanese could walk in and take us with girl guides.
We were packed off to bed early that night because we were told we'd be up before dawn in the morning, still in our white uniforms, to line the cliffs with our newly acquired rifles and our pockets full of ammunition to stem the tide of the Japanese invasion. We thought this was a certain end. We waited for the dawn, but fortunately when the sun came up there was no sign of troop ships or other form of invasion, so we were mightily relieved.
The Japanese troops hadn't landed, but Darwin was still about to fall under the command of a hostile force, its own military police, the Provo Corps. They begin to dish out their unique brand of law and order.
And at this point, one of the military police, a guy called MacArthur Onslow, takes it upon himself. He charges into the civil police station, brandishing a pistol and saying Darwin's under martial law.
I think it was on the afternoon of the air raid when Sergeant Major MacArthur Onslow came to the police station and told us martial law was declared. He said, "We are tops and you will take orders from us." He was brandishing a revolver at the time.
Drunk and unruly, the Provo Corps begin to terrorise the already traumatised citizens.
I was told by Mr. Abbott that there was trouble at the half mile, that the Provo Corps had stopped some people and there was trouble.
Sergeant! Sergeant! I'm a court officer! Holster that weapon! Holster that weapon! Calm down, please, calm down!
MacArthur Onslow was there. He was drunker than usual. He was pretty bad. There was a train leaving shortly after. At the time, the army had decided that no men should leave Darwin. There were the old men, some who'd been slightly wounded, and some who were sick. During this time, the Provo Corps were firing over the heads of the crowd. The crowd were giving no trouble at that time. It was a disgraceful matter.
Move away from the train!
So at this point, the police believe that the army are in control, so if an order comes out purporting to come from the army, they feel obliged to try to enforce it or push it along. The Provos, they had a different agenda. Basically, looting began, and they were the ringleaders.
With no one seemingly enforcing the law, houses left abandoned by the fleeing population became easy pickings for looters.
I saw 2 American trucks go into the New Darwin Hotel and take their great ropes out and put them around a couple of big refrigerators and drag them out.
And 2 Chinese ships that were called into Darwin were caught at Townsville, full of Darwin loot, which had been looted by both Americans and Australians in an organised racket and sent south for sale.
The other thing about it is whether it ever be decided it was looting, because we were preparing to burn the town down.
Most of the people, when they left Darwin, if they ever passed into the troops, they told the troops, just take it. Whatever you need, take it, because they didn't want the Japs to get it anyhow.
Food became a problem, and we certainly went to houses, looked in fridges for food. I got a carton of pilchards. I lived on those 24 cans of pilchards for quite some time.
We looted also, with some of it with permission, but otherwise we couldn't have cared less. We looted for rags to clean the guns. We looted for batteries to run the instruments in the command post. We looted battery chargers to charge the batteries because we didn't have any power.
You could defend some of the looting. I mean, the civilian population had gone, food's very scarce, but there's a big gap between taking the chickens and the milk out of the fridge and nicking the refrigerator itself and the fans and the radios and what have you. And suddenly the officers' messes had all the comforts of home, somebody else's home.
When news reports eventually reach the wider world, they don't reflect the true state of affairs in Darwin. The death toll and scale of the destruction are greatly understated. Reports like these will lead to accusations of a government cover-up to hide the true extent of the Darwin disaster.
Casualties in the Japanese raids against Darwin on February the 19th arrive in Sydney aboard the newly equipped Red Cross train. They've been through the mill, but there isn't a drooping tail on the train.
Well, all I gotta say is Darwin has shown Aussie how to take it. Let us all show the Japs how we can dish it out.
That's the spirit. Even badly hurt men were completely cheerful. The first Australians to be wounded on their own soil by enemy action are pretty sore about it. In the phrase of their Prime Minister, they are fighting mad.
By suppressing the facts, Curtin will be accused of lying to the Australian public.
Now, insofar as the supposed cover-up by the Australian government of what happened in Darwin, we've got to look at what actually happened. And ironically, it was Darwin that was the trigger for it all. Not the raid, but the raid that never happened.
On January the 4th, 1942, almost 7 weeks before the real Darwin raid, several newspapers published false stories of a bombing attack on Darwin. Their information came from enemy propaganda broadcasts. The government was horrified.
The chief censor stepped in and said that newspapers were in future not to carry reports from enemy sources. And then that morphed again until it became the only thing you can report is what we tell you. Now, Curtin, there's clear evidence that Curtin wanted to tell the truth. We've got telex messages passing from Curtin's office to the Ministry of Defence.
In view of the stories being circulated by evacuees from Darwin, which suggest a very large death toll, the Prime Minister desires to release an official and authoritative statement showing the numbers killed and injured, both service and civilian.
And the Chiefs of Staff came back like lightning, saying it would not be in the national interest to tell the truth. Now, I suspect that not in the national interest meant not in the interest of the Chiefs of Staff.
These developments would play a significant role in the way information about the real bombing of Darwin and the events that followed would be relayed to the Australian people.
Nobody knew because we weren't allowed to talk about it. We weren't allowed to write letters, even under censorship, for 3 months.
We finally got a letter from my father, which was a huge excitement. And my mother opened the envelope and it came out in strips like confetti. And the censors had actually cut the letter into shreds, removing any indication of anything that was going on in Darwin.
With the nation being handed an incomplete story, it would be left to Charles Lowe to give the definitive account in his final report.
The delay in giving the general warning was fraught with disaster. There is much in the evidence which suggests that a warning of 20 minutes or even of 15 minutes might have enabled vessels in the harbour to get underway and move, and to have had a far better opportunity of avoiding the enemy attack. Had there been effective leadership at that stage, I think that normal conditions might very rapidly have been attained. But leadership was conspicuously lacking.
Lowe turned in a very fine report, and he singled out only 2 people. I mean, it described Sturt Griffith's order to send the men half a mile down the road and half a mile into the bush, which went wrong with Chinese whispers. He described that as unfortunate. Well, it was certainly unfortunate, but it's rather temperate language. And he did say that he felt that if there had been proper leadership after the raid, then the bad developments need not have taken place. And at that he was pointing the finger at Aubrey Abbott.
However, the Lowe report would not be published until October 1945, 3 years after the events. And the bombing of Darwin would remain a largely untold story in Australia's history.
And I suppose we didn't talk too much about what happened. It wasn't one of those things you carried on a conversation about what you'd been through. You kept it yourself.
We didn't talk about it. We were ashamed to talk about it. That's the word.
The phrase that keeps coming back is day of shame. Well, I don't buy that, because the day of shame is all about the Adelaide River Stakes, the civilian population shot through. Well, that's what civilians do. So I don't see any shame in that. And there were brave performances. There was enormous courage from the gunners who kept firing and firing. The people on the harbour are just beyond praise. These are people in rowboats going through burning oil, picking up the wounded out of the harbour. I mean, there were enormous acts of courage. So day of shame, no.
You are here on the spot where the Japanese bombed us, where for the first time in our history, we were attacked by an enemy who brought the war to us. And suddenly, you're fighting for your life in the streets of Darwin.
Darwin would experience a total of 64 air raids over the next 2 years, but nothing of the scale of the 19th of February, 1942.
Eventually, we were recognised by the government when they gave us the 3945 star in 1995. So we waited 43 years before we were recognised as having been in action at all.
I don't think people quite realised the nature of dive bombing and the terror that this causes when you have dive bombers coming down from thousands of feet directly at the ship.
I think it was, for a young fellow, it was pretty traumatic. I don't think about it except when I see it on television or something reminds me, and then I get a bit.
There's a Coral Sea, there was a Pearl Harbor, you name them, all got names, Tobruk, etc., etc. There's no name given to Darwin, and it was a battle. There's no exaggeration when I say that, and yet Australia knows nothing about it.